Tonight's program is presented as part of the 2017-2018 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme, Music, the Beat of Our City, through Greg Kott's book, I'll Take You There, Mavis Staples, the Staple Singers, and the Music That Shaped the Civil Rights Era. For more information on other music-related programming, visit onebookonechicago.org. Tonight, we present a discussion in celebration of the life and legacy of the godfather of house music, Frankie Knuckles. Few people in Chicago music history have made the lasting impact that Frankie Knuckles did during his too short life. A DJ, record producer, and remixer, Frankie began his career as a teenager playing soul, disco, and R&B at disco clubs in New York City. After moving to Chicago, he made his home at the Warehouse, mixing disco classics, indie soul, rock, synth, and all kinds of beats not heard anywhere else. Frankie was responsible for the development of what we now call house music. Throughout his career, he worked with many DJs and producers, some of whom we'll talk to tonight, remixed countless tracks, and was a resident or guest DJ at clubs all around the globe. Among his awards are a place in the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame and the Dance Music Hall of Fame, a Grammy Award for Remixer of the Year, and an honorary street and day named after him in 2004, helped along by a then little-known Illinois state senator named Barack Obama. In addition to his music work, Frankie was known for his generosity of spirit and devotion to charitable causes, including music in schools, LGBT youth, diabetes research and education, and AIDS research and prevention. And on a personal note, at a former job, I was working on an AIDS fundraiser night at Smart Bar. Frankie asked me how much we had raised, and I told him it was about $2,000, not too shabby. Frankie shook his head, pulled a check out of his pocket, and wrote a match. He winked at me, put a finger to his lips, and said, shh, and handed the check over like he was Santa Claus. I think that's a good example of who he was. Now let's introduce tonight's panel. Frederick Dunson, best friend and business partner of Frankie Knuckles, founded the Frankie Knuckles Foundation in 2014 to advance Frankie's mission as the global ambassador of house music through media, conservation, and public events focused on music in schools, LGBTQ youth homelessness, AIDS research and prevention, and diabetes research and education. Retired from a career with the clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County, Frederick has dedicated his service work to the foundation and is also involved with charitable work with the Chicago International Film Festival's Black Perspectives Committee, the Empowerment Center for Better Living, and the West Loop Community Organization. Our special thanks to Frederick for his assistance in making tonight's event happen. Joel Hall, a native of Chicago's Cabrini Green neighborhood, established and co-founded the Chicago City Theater Company in 1974. This unique performing arts organization includes the Chicago City Theater Company, the Joel Hall Dancers, and a training facility, the Joel Hall Dancers and Center. He is the artistic director and choreographer for his dance company and the chief dance instructor for the training studio. During the past 40 years, he has achieved an international reputation for his dance company and acclaim as a choreographer whose work in his own unique dance based in jazz expresses a rich vocabulary embracing both classical and modern dance idioms. DJ and producer Ralphie Rosario has been spinning records since the early 80s. A member of the legendary Chicago Hot Mix 5, Ralphie delivered his DJ mix magic on the airwaves of WBMX for over a decade, helping to give birth to house music pioneers of Chicago. His crossover hit, You Used to Hold Me, became an overnight house music classic, and since then, Ralphie has traveled the globe, remixed countless megapop stars, received a Grammy nomination, and contributed music to television shows Sex and the City, Queer as Folk, and So You Think You Can Dance. He continues to produce and DJ around the world and in Chicago. Darlene Jackson, aka Lady D, has been called Chicago's house music queen by Chicago Magazine. Performing sets for audiences around the world, Lady D has been DJing, touring, collaborating on music projects since 1995. She manages her music label and events company, Delectable, hosts a show on Vocalo.org, and works as a creative industry liaison for the Career Center at Columbia College Chicago. Finally, we are especially thankful for our moderator this evening, Joe Shanahan, for his assistance in putting tonight's event together. Joe began his journey in artistic propriety as a Columbia College graduate with a keen ear for the underground music shaking Chicago's musical core. Joe spent his post-collegiate years trekking to New York and London to experience the happenings redefining the global arts community. He returned with an act local, think global business philosophy and an urge to fill the void in his home city's art scene. Joe opened Metro and Smart Bar, independent clubs that support and showcase new and emerging talent, over 35 years ago, and recently added G-Man to his portfolio. And we are expecting DJ Heather is running a little bit late, and she will appear, and we'll bring her on stage when she comes. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests for the conversation.
Well, that's quite an introduction. Thank you, Jenny Lezak. When this kind of came together, you never know how it's going to roll, but just being back in the green room, and I mean a really green room, we just all started talking right away, picking up where we left off, because I know all of these people on this panel, and I'm very fortunate and very honored to be sitting on this stage with them.
That makes me too. I love that.
So part of this is that, I thought that we would start it out by doing a little bit of a question to each and every panelist about their first time they met Frankie and their first impression. So kind of a personal question to each and every one of the panelists. Everyone's got a Frankie story. We want to hear some of yours later, but I'll start with Frederick Dunson.
Somehow I knew you were going to do that.
Come on, baby. So when did you first meet him, and what was your first impression?
I think the fall of 1976, and I was a child, literally, for those out there trying to add. I met him through a friend of ours who is a DJ. I guess he's still a DJ. His name is Kurt Robinson. He lives in D.C. And I had a brother who was 3 years older than me that was going to the warehouse, but he didn't know that I was hanging out in clubs. At any rate, we kind of put it all together, and we went to a after hours club, not down the street from here in the 600 block on South Federal, called the Bowery.
The Bowery?
The Bowery. And at that time, the South Loop was desolate. I mean, there was nothing. Even when we went in this building, we were like, where in the hell where are we going? I mean, because it was a office building, but it looked like it had been bombed out. Long story short, get upstairs, and Chicagoans being Chicagoans, you all know how we are. Frankie walks in, and so Kurt takes us over to him because people were kind of standoffish about him for whatever reason, and we started talking. And my first impression of him was he was really kind of shy. Mm-hmm. So if you knew Frankie, there's some truth to that he was shy, but then again he wasn't. So we became friends, not at that point, but that same year. So
was he DJing that night?
No.
It was just a social engagement.
He was just hanging out.
Okay.
Robert Williams had brought him out from New York, and he had relocated here. Robert was living in South Shore at that point. Mm-hmm. And he was just trying to get a feel for what was going on in the city. Now I know that, but at that point he was just hanging out.
He was just hanging out.
Yeah,
nice.
And so people were not as befriending to him as the group of us. Mm-hmm. So that's how we became friends.
Welcome, Heather. We know that traffic is crazy out there, but there's a microphone you might have to share with Mr. Hall. So when did you first meet Frankie, and what was your first impression of him?
Well, I think he had such a, kind of larger-than-life persona to me. So I'd known him from listening to the radio, obviously, and buying records, etc. And seeing him play. And actually, the first time I met him, I was introduced to him when I was in Ibiza playing, and he was playing a party at Amnesia or Pasha or something like that. And Sneak, Carlos Sosa, Chicago DJ as well, said, you should meet Frankie. I was like, okay, cool. This is a big moment for me.
So you met him in another country?
In another country.
Okay.
Through another Chicagoan by chance.
That's great.
And so, it's loud, so it's thumping and stuff.
Sure.
In the booth, and Sneak calls me over, and he's like, hey, Frankie, Heather, Frankie. I was like, oh, pleasure to meet you, all that stuff, Stardust in the eyes and everything. And he's like, I heard about you. And I was like, okay, well, I hope that's good, hope that's good stuff. Or I know about you, girl. I'm like, oh, okay, well, thank you.
That must have
You
made
know,
you feel
so
pretty
I
good.
think that, you know, for me, that was kind of cool that, you know, Frankie Knuckles knows of me or knows who I am. So that was the first time I met him actually in the flesh and had a chance to chat after he played, et cetera. And then, you know, subsequent times, it's like I'd never really had a chance to hang and chat as much as I'd like. But I felt like we were always just kind of these little magnets that would never really connect, but always would connect if we saw each other, just on a really positive note. And that's always what I got from him, just an aura of kindness. Obviously, you see it in his smile.
Oh, yeah.
But there was something really just genuine and relaxed, and also all about business in a way. You know
Sure,
what I'm saying?
sure.
But just a pleasure to be around, and I really appreciated everything that he did, as well as everything that he stood for.
So it was a good impression. You made a good impression from you. Mr. Hall, how are you, Joel?
I'm good.
Fantastic. What was your first meeting with Frankie, and what was your first impressions?
My first meeting with Frankie was very similar to a story we heard earlier. It was at the warehouse.
Okay, at the club.
And I was at the warehouse when I was very, 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 very young. Very, very young. And had no business in there really, but was there anyway. And
So this is 206 Jefferson? This is 206 Jefferson?
this was on, we were discussing this earlier, this was on Jack.
555 Adams.
So, okay, that address.
We
Where
had to
Kent
take the
Law
elevator
School
up
is.
to
Got it. Right. Okay.
floor.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little intimidating the first time I went there. I was saying earlier that because it was a desolate area of the city at that time of night, and it wouldn't open until after hours. So we ended up, a couple of friends of mine ended up going to the warehouse after Club Luray.
Oh, yeah.
So, so Club Luray was my original hangout until I
Where was that located at?
was at Club Luray, please.
Joel, where was that located at?
On Halsted and Belmont.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was a very unique space and very house space.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard about the warehouse and went to the warehouse with a couple of other friends of mine. And that's where I first met Frankie. And it was very casual at our beginning of our relationship. He was a very, very shy person. And until he got to know you. And then he was like real, just real genuine.
Yeah.
And I had traveled with my company several times to Europe, and we did a lot of dance. I would overlay house with my pieces, in all of my pieces, and a lot of the music that I was using was Frankie's music overlaid with music and spliced into music and all this, including running it into classical and so forth. Just trying to find ways of reinventing this movement for my dancers. And I was on a plane from London back to Chicago, and Frankie actually came and tapped me on the shoulder. He was sitting in the seat right behind me, which was coincidence.
Sure.
We had a great conversation on the way back, and from there we maintained our relationship as he knew what I was doing there.
Just a side note, I actually had a very similar experience where I was flying back from New York City, and Frankie and I sat next to each other. So that was a very interesting thing. And and we had to ask the person that was supposed to be sitting there to move over. And this was in first class, so it was actually very nice that the guy moved over, and Frankie and I got to talk all the way home. 2 hours, a lot of talking.
I have a similar story too, Joe.
right?
I flew with him also on the way to London.
He's on an airplane a lot.
I told the stewardess to have him removed. That wasn't his seat. But then he looked up at me and he's turned around. He said, "Oh, hell no."
So Ralphie, what is your impression and your first meeting of Frankie and your impression of him on your?
It was at the power plant, Frederick.
Okay, 1015 North Halsted, right?
Benji Espinoza took me there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and he goes, "Come on, let's go see Frankie." I'm like, "It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm done. I was working until 2 or 3. I don't want to go out anymore."
Where were you working at that time?
It was a Hot Mix 5 thing, so we had like 3 gigs in one night kind of thing.
Okay.
So we were doing an hour in South Chicago, an hour in Indiana, and then an hour back in the city.
Mm-hmm.
So then turns around, and Benji wants to take me to the power plant to see Frankie. I'm like, "I'm tired. I don't want to go anywhere." So he says, come on, you're going to have a good time." So we walk in, never saw it, never heard of it, nothing. Walked in, it was really pitch black in there. And all I saw was a strobe light, and the walls were vibrating. Slightly, okay? So then I walk in there, and he brings me into the DJ booth. Benji brings me into the DJ booth, and Frankie's got his, I call him his little telephone headphone thing.
Yeah, sure.
And then he puts it down, and Benji goes, "Frankie, this is Ralphie Rosario." and Frankie turns around and he goes, "Welcome." And then 2 seconds later, there was a bowl of grapes, Cheetos, bananas,
Sure,
apples,
right.
water,
Right.
a buffet in the DJ booth, right?
You were ready to have
The
fun.
after-hours food of the gods back in the day,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
So
That was a
then
good
I'm
impression.
sitting there. I was just watching him. I just watched him work. I was scared, intimidated. I was in awe. He was playing Jamie Principle, "Waiting on My Angel,"
Oh, there you go.
and
Beautiful.
just a strobe light in a big black box with an amazing sound system.
Yeah.
How many of you guys know what I'm talking about? Have you ever experienced that? We don't have that anymore in the city, and God, I wish we had that again.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
so then I'm sitting there, and he's playing "Waiting on My Angel," and 2 seconds later, the crossover for the bass kicks in, and the whole place starts screaming. And I turned around going, "What the hell's going on?" The walls just came alive out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And he was just in his element. I didn't want to bother him. It's like one of those things when you have a DJ, you love this DJ, you just let him do his thing. And then before you know it, we became friends. We were traveling. I've run into him at different countries, different nights we were working together or opposite each other. He came to my house several times for Christmas, which I thought was an amazing thing. It was his time to relax and disconnect, and it was just like we were buddies.
That's fantastic.
buddies.
Brilliant. Darlene, Lady D, when did you meet Frankie, and what was your first impression of him?
So I met Frankie. I actually met him at a Chosen Few picnic when it was still a picnic behind the Museum of Science and Industry.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But I had the chance to stand in his booth before when early in my career. He was doing one of his annual parties, and the guy I was dating, they were familiar with each other, and so we got invited into the booth, and I just kind of stood back and observed.
Where was
And
that at?
That was at the House of Blues.
Okay.
So, and he was playing some Shaka Khan, one of his special remixes, and I was just mesmerized. You know, I'd known of him through high school. I had never been to the warehouse at that point. And it was just, he was inviting. He was like, "Sure, come on in." And we must have stood there for I don't know how long, but I didn't want to leave.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
went home and I practiced and I played a lot differently after that night. And but the first time.
So a lasting impression.
Lasting impression, and maybe life-changing. Frederick and Jamie Principle were the ones that actually put us together face to face, where at this picnic, they're running around, I'm running around, mingling with people, and between the two of them, they kept asking me, "Have you talked to Frankie yet? Have you met Frankie?" And I was like, "No, I'm just kind of avoiding him a little bit because he's Frankie." But they were like, "No, he wants to meet you. Come over." So somebody, and I want to say both of them, grabbed me by the hand, one of them for sure, and took me right in front of him. And he said, "Oh, you're Lady D." He was like, and gave me a kiss on the lips. And so,
Oh.
and I said to myself, "Wait a minute, isn't he gay?" I was like, wow, this is like shocks through my body. So then I was like, I could turn him.
There you go. Lady D. I love it. Brilliant.
Oh my God, I had no idea, Darlene.
So My quick story is that because I don't know, no one can top that. But is that in my mind, Frankie was sort of the they call him the godfather of house, but he was like the architect. He laid the foundation, he built it, he built the house. And I was a young bartender and waiter, and I was just kind of putting my little club idea together in my brain and in my loft on Wells Street. And we'd finish our shifts tending bar and waiting tables, and we would head to 206 Jefferson. And I would say that for me, it was just getting in line, lining up, walking into that room, as Ralphie was explaining, like just a black box with an amazing sound system. And I would kind of get in, and I'd kind of go up by the DJ booth, and every so often he'd look over and he'd motion for me to come into the booth. So I would be able to come in and just kind of hang out with him and just sort of sit there. And so that when I got ready to do and open up Smart Bar, my first phone call was to Frankie to have him DJ at the opening of Smart Bar. And that started a 35-year relationship of music, fun, family. I thank Frederick for being my partner on many of these years. But I do remember, back in the day, I'd wear fry boots. Remember, Ralphie? And put my little pint of Stolichnaya in my fry boot and go in. And Frankie always had cranberry juice, so I'd be like, "Hey, you want to spike that up a little bit?" So I'd pour him.
And don't forget the Cheetos either.
Yeah, I'd eat the banana and maybe an apple and orange, and I'd say, "Hey, how about a little spike in the drink?" So I'd bring him a little portable bar in my boot. So that's my first impression of Frankie, was that big smile, and he'd say, "Let's have a drink." So no, the Smart Bar would not be what it is without the fact that we did that. And part of that story is that Frankie spun in the penthouse, or what was the fourth floor of Smart Bar, and we had Africa Bambaataa and Soul Sonic Force in Metro. So it was this really great juxtaposition of New York and house and Chicago together. My impression of him is still a good one and long-lasting. Second question. How did his work and musical direction affect you, Frederick? Because you became his business partner here in Chicago. So you watched him sort of have, the ebb and flow of his career. Winning a Grammy, the first DJ to basically win a Grammy for a remix. They invented the category for Frankie. For you, what was the sort of, how did his work and musical direction affect you?
So the continuation of your first question into the second, to answer the second part, that's better, is that eventually, because of our friendship, or because of me meeting him, I ended up working at the warehouse, working several different positions at the warehouse.
Oh, I remember you from the door. Membership, sir.
Thanks, Joe.
That's a total read.
At any rate, let's chronologically go through this. Sure. So then he leaves, goes to the power plant. And at the power plant, I didn't really work for him, but I kind of consulted with him on some things.
Mm-hmm.
And then he decides to leave and move back home to New York, or move back to his birthplace in New York, because he always considered Chicago his home because he spent so much time here.
Is that when he went to work for the Sound Factory? Is that the...
Well, he went back not knowing where he was going to land.
Got it.
For a minute. He then started working gigs, I think, like The World.
Sure.
Blah, 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 blah.
Exactly.
Ended up signing on with Def Mix, and then the travel starts.
Mm-hmm.
And so once the travel starts, he would come here occasionally. And I remember one evening he played at this event for a friend of ours, and it was at the Riviera. And this is around the time that the Riviera was notoriously known for being nasty. I mean, they were homophobic, and it got to the point of it really, really bothered him that night. And I remember him walking over to me because I was kind of repping him, sort of, kind of. And he said, you know, I'm not going to do this anymore. The next time I come back here, it's going to be me and you. And so that was that conversation was the catalyst of us becoming business partners. But I think, to answer your question, travel and certainly the time in New York made him think about differently how what we were doing could be done.
Sure.
And I have to say that I was very fortunate to have a business partner, because if there was something we collectively wanted, or ideal, or theme or something, Frankie would not spare any expense. So I think the sensibilities that I have about the business, I think I got from him and Robert. And I'm so appreciative of those things because now I look back on them and say, ooh, you know, the things that we were doing were a little ahead of our time, but not so much. But I think we did it with a certain flair.
Again, I think that you probably helped elevate the game, so to speak, because when he began to do his like floating party between different venues in Chicago, House of Blues, of course, Riviera, before he settled into some other things, you helped elevate the game. His game elevated because of the travel. He was
Yes.
seeing DJ booths and sound systems in Spain or in Italy or in London. I mean, whether it was Ministry of Sound or whether it was Pasha or Amnesia or any of these places, that's where it becomes like, okay, bring what he experienced back to Chicago. You helped facilitate that.
Well,
You created that standard.
You did. You helped create it. There's no question about it because that's when.
Thank you, but I don't kind of look at it that way. I just kind of look at we were doing what we were doing, sort of like the 206 business model.
Right.
We were doing what we were doing,
Right.
and just trying to have fun doing it. And then it would always bother him because I'm numbers driven. To this day, I'm still numbers driven. So he would be like, I don't care about us not going home with any money. And I'd look at him, I'd be like, you know. And he'd be like, it's not the point. He was like, everybody had a great time.
Sure.
Everybody had a great time, and we gave them something. And he was really big about that. So, you know, we'd start thinking about what we were going to give, CDs, T-shirts, something. He was like, people should always leave your parties with something, you know, because it's a part of you that would go with them, and it's something they could always, a tangible thing that people could always hold on to.
Yeah, that I think is very evident in the long-lasting, you know, business relationship he does have here in Chicago. Heather, you're an artist. So how did his work in musical direction, you know, affect you and inspire you? It's interesting because, you know, I've heard you spin and I know where you kind of go and what you do.
Right.
Let everybody know, like, you know, did he?
You know, it's kind of hard to kind of put into words because from an artist perspective or just, you know, a kind of grinding DJ kind of feeling, I always felt that his contribution or his influence to me was always about the W New York side of the music that he made. And so I was
Sure.
always a big fan of his dubs and what I'm just a dub person. I'm into drums. I'm into that kind of feelings of grandeur when you know it's a really big Frankie Knuckles production. So for me, he kind of bridged that New York gap for house sound and how it translated through Chicago again. So as just, again, a person that tends to play quite a bit and travels quite
Sure.
a bit, that's kind of what I've always taken from him.
But when you're coming up through, like, you know, Super Jane,
Sure.
you know, when I first met you, and you know, I'm getting down to like an idea, like, was there like you say, a dubbier sound?
Yeah, and
that-
also when you're talking about branding events and stuff
Yeah.
like that, you can kind of draw that correlation for what we did with Super Jane in terms
Exactly. Yeah.
of party production
Yeah.
and kind of putting our own stamp on things in
Right.
terms of when you would see DJs play, it was our our effort to kind of showcase women who happen to be DJs. So every time you looked in the booth, there would be a woman playing.
Exactly.
When we initially started, it would be about the person who met you at the door happened to be a woman. The person bartending happened to
Right,
be a woman.
right.
And it was more of just emulating what we saw other people doing in terms of their productions, in terms of showcasing their friends and putting
So
them
again,
on.
sort of he's an architect of like
course.
how those successful
Exactly.
parties and those successful events came about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Joel, you kind of touched on it a little earlier about how, his music or his musical direction affected you and your dance company. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit on the idea of how the music was part of that for your activities?
Well, I think that Frankie inspired movement, whether you were a dancer or not. I mean, if a person considered themselves a dancer, he inspired you, and if you didn't consider yourself a dancer and you were just out moving, you were inspired by what he had contributed. And to this day, I think that almost every single piece that I have choreographed, even now, is representing house in some direction, because I think it plays a very important role in
Mhm.
the development of American music
Mhm.
and its contribution to the world, particularly out of Chicago. Fortunately, our company has had the chance to perform all over the world. We've been in Russia or the former Soviet Union. We've been through England and Ireland,
And you would use house music in
we
these
use house
productions?
music everywhere. And
Mhm.
every place that we went to a house club.
Hmm.
In every
As a
city
company,
we
to dance,
visited,
to hang out.
where we were performing
Mhm.
in Inverness, Scotland.
There you
was
go.
a house club.
Sure there is.
Okay, so it was really interesting because it's so powerful, and it has had that influence all this time, and I think that it'll be around for a very, very long time. As I said, I think it's played a very important role in who we are and who we represent as people in this country on a global scale.
Oh, absolutely. It was the language that traveled and was spoken very far.
Yes.
Was house music, and
It's-
Frankie was one of the,
He was the man.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
out there doing it.
Absolutely.
Everywhere. And
Was there one song possibly that you remember, or maybe his own? Well, I'm just saying one of his songs that you put, one of his original pieces that what came into.
I think the song that he created towards the end of when he was here was the Whistle Song.
Okay, there you go.
And I still listen to that now.
Sure, just a
It's a
classic.
beautiful, beautiful.
It's just a
beautiful
classic. Absolutely.
And that was my very favorite. I mean, there's so many.
But that's the one that you would put into some of the work for the dancers for Joel Hall.
That among others.
Great, great. So Ralphie, I'm going to tell a quick story, okay? Because this happened to me, and Frankie did this for me, and we talked about this backstage, but I felt it was such a fun story. I want to tell everybody. So I'm like, Smart Bar's a few years into its run, and I go to New York, and I go to the Paradise Garage, and Frankie's there. And I'm like, oh boy, there's my friend. Hi. He's up in the booth with Larry Levan, Shep Pettibone's there, Judy Weinstein's there. It's the whole crowd. And so I get come on up. So I'm like, up the stairs. I'm like, get there. Me and my friend John Sulak, my original partner from Smart Bar. And we get up there, and I walk into the booth, and I was pretty, whoa. I was like, okay, I don't know if I'm high or if I'm just really high, because there's a lot going on there. And I walk into the booth, and I see it, and Frankie's like, Joe, this is Larry. And Larry's like, hello, how you doing? I'm like, great, really great. And then at that moment, Ralphie's record, "You Used to Hold Me," came on. And I was like, okay, here we go. Remember that song? "You Used to Hold Me"? Xavier Hollander? Anyway, so I was standing there and I was like, oh my God, here is Chicago in the house.
One of those stories that I had no idea.
I know, but I had to tell it, right? I just had to bring it to the panel. But it's true, and I think that, Ralph, you must have a story about his work, about his music direction, and how it affected you, again, as an artist and as just a fan.
As an artist, I'd have to say on the remixer side, in the production aspect of it, he paid so much attention to detail. In one of the interviews, he talked about like how he has people buzzing around him in the studio, all going to the same vision and envisioning the same thing as the end result, and that is what inspired me to become a better remixer and a production person in recording. So my first thing was being a geek and just geeking out and being a recording engineer, but then the musical part started coming in when I heard Frankie doing his original work, when I heard Frankie doing his original remixes, and they were, all of a sudden, he made them his own. They became a whole entity. It bought the artist, it catapulted them into a whole different area.
Exactly.
You would have never known who Alison Limerick was if it didn't hear Where Love Lives. You would have never, yeah, we're first choice fans, but you would have never heard Let No Man Put Us Under.
No. No.
So those kind of things inspired me to become a better remixer, pay attention to detail, and really pay attention to what it is you're doing musically and technically.
Yeah.
And so he left that with me. He always did. Just like he molded a lot of stuff he did with Morales and a lot of stuff with all the people at Def Mix. All those people inspired me.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's what made me want to.
But his attention to detail.
His attention to detail. Exactly.
Right. And one other thing you were saying to me just about something that you're working on currently with Dee and with others is that, you talk about this sort of arrangement, this lush, these pads, the piano. Could you talk a little bit about
He had a signature, right?
What was that signature?
The signature of the lush pads.
What
the
does that
signature
mean?
of that, the pads, meaning like a string or something, a chord that was, just like Whistle Song had a chord, it started with a chord, started with a string, started with a pad. It's that same thing, and he was lush about it when he put it together, as even in all the piano lines and everything, and all that stuff.
And there's a
the programmers
definitive
knew-
sound for that.
Yeah.
That's very
They all
Frankie.
knew. They all knew his vision. They knew
Absolutely.
what was going on. So when he had those people around him, they all reached for the same thing, and each time it was such a successful piece of music.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Lady D. Oh, there you go. I wanted to share.
Sharing is caring. So
So what's that? What's for you? It's like
So
you,
on
as
the-
an artist and then as
right.
a fan too. I'd like to know because
Sure.
you're in both worlds. Delectable.
both. All,
Mhm.
in three worlds. As a DJ,
Mhm.
just actually watching him work, I always felt like he had the most flawless mixes. I felt like his style is just elegant, and when you talk about his body of work, the way the classic sound became synonymous with Frankie's sound, just the way he became the brand of what classic house is. So among some other people, but I really feel like he was the first to really like define that sound and come away with, that title. So from that side, I was really influenced to try to be flawless sometimes and to try to encompass that elegance sometimes in my mix. And I think sometimes a mix calls for that. Sometimes it calls for you to be a little more dirty. But
I've heard your Vocalo 5 p.m.
I
mixes.
like to
know.
mix it up.
Yeah,
I'm not satisfied. I like variety. So,
But elegant, lush,
but elegant,
piano-driven
yes,
pads.
right.
Mhm.
So I like the fact that I learned to play in that fashion when the time calls for it, and I think I learned that by watching him a lot
Mhm.
and listening to him. And then on the artist side, I think he did something for me. He put me on one of the most amazing lineups ever. He was part of a house music festival that probably was the precursor to all house music festivals here, that somebody deigned to do something so big and on a grand scale.
Where was that at?
That was at Northerly Island,
Mhm.
and Frederick was part of that, and being the only woman DJ to be on that lineup with him, Danny Tenaglia, David Morales, my friend Ralph Rosario, Derek Carter,
Mm-hmm.
Jocelyn Brown, Barbara Tucker,
That's a big lineup.
So it felt very like I was being verified at that point. That was in 2006. So
Mm-hmm.
I always felt, I've had the stamp of approval from
Chosen.
chosen,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. So
Sure.
from an artist standpoint, I felt like he gave me a real gift in that, in doing that.
Yeah. It must have been that kiss. Ah!
I told you.
But just to spin off that real quickly. So Frederick, that's interesting because I think that again we talk about, Frankie as an artist, as an innovator. Again, the remixing, the original material. Then there's the business side. There's the innovator, someone who did take some chances by doing that at a big event out at Northerly Island. That was a big step, And
Well, I didn't think anybody was going to talk about it, but gee,
but again,
no.
way before many of these other things, and so we understand that he was not one to be afraid to try something, and it maybe wasn't financially successful or whatever, but it was artistically and aesthetically successful.
Again, numbers person. So of course, 2006. Artistically it was incredible. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better lineup, a better venue. I think we as a collective were a little presumptuous in thinking that it would be supported. I think people here were not ready for that kind of an event. Certainly the Europeans were, but we were relying on the locals.
Right.
I think he how do I say this? I think when putting it together, he thought about it because he was away for a large part of the planning of it. And he's like, okay, so what are you guys doing? And he would add his input. I think it changed the dynamic of how him and I became to do business because of it not being successful for whatever reason.
Sure.
People felt that it was a political sort of thing and there were no politics involved because certainly the city had nothing to do with it. Maybe they meant in terms of the business it was political, but certainly we were trying to bring the best of the best to the forefront. And I think the other part of that was that people just weren't ready to pay $40, $50, $60 for that type of event.
Being an innovator, taking a risk, again, as you said earlier, okay, so we didn't make any money on this one, but we did something.
Well, no, that's what he would say.
I'm just saying. No. So,
my comments was a little different. Just a tinge different.
So conversely, my piece of this is that when he opened Power Plant, I followed him from the warehouse to the power plant, and I brought him a business idea. There was a record store here in Chicago called Wax Trax Records. They were celebrating their 5th anniversary. Yeah, we all did that Wax Trax thing. And so I went to him and said, look, Jim and Danny, good friends of mine, we all know each other. Let's celebrate the 5th anniversary of Wax Trax at the power plant. And Frankie was like, we can do that. So he gave me basically a Saturday night, and we flew in some DJs from New York, and we flew in some DJs. We had some DJs here in Chicago, and we did a big party that I have to say, does anyone remember that party? Were you there? Any of you there? Well, it was very crowded, and it was very hot, and there were a lot of people dancing, and it went from we had Fab Five Freddy be the host, we had DJ WizKid, and then we had Frankie, and I don't know the other local DJ we had, but we were standing on the radiators in the power plant, like literally losing our minds because we got into that hyper bass sound. All of a sudden, it was clicked on, It kicked in. And I think it was Jamie Principle again. And I swear to God, the radiator that we were all standing on broke, and there was a flood. And I looked at Frankie. I go, what are we going to do? He goes, we keep going, baby. I was like, I love you. It was like we were going to let a little bit of water dampen our spirits, so to speak. But that was a very successful party. We all made some money that night. I do remember that. one more round, I think, because we want to do some Q&A. I know there's people have been very patient listening, and you probably have some questions for us. And where's Jenny Lezak? How are we doing on time? Okay. So how did the local and then global scope of his work and reputation, in your opinion, and how did he create that civically? This is more of a business question possibly for you, Frederick. I mean, so he's working in Europe. He's making a lot of money in Europe. He's got to come to Chicago and do
a lot, but
well,
he's
he
making
make-
some.
I think he was making more money in Europe than he was in America.
Oh, absolutely.
So again, that
Absolutely.
shows again this weird thing about Chicago that we all up here talk about on a regular basis. But so when he came back, you know, how when you began to do his residency, so to speak, there was one at Smart Bar, there was one at House of Blues. How did the local and global sort of lens begin to reflect?
I think a lot of it was easy because of his reputation and because he traveled and because people knew what kind of draw he was. I remember one night at the House of Blues, we would always get, well, I would get these requests for blah, blah, blah's coming in town and blah, blah, blah wants to show and blah, blah, blah wants to bring an entourage. And of course, he'd be like, oh, sure. You know, I'd be like, no. She, he, their manager, blah, 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 blah. And so he'd be like, well, why are you being like that? And I'm like, no, I'm not being like anything. You know.
You were watching The Interest.
Yes, thank you, Joe. That's a great way of putting it. But I think with that global perspective, and I think traveling with him kind of gave me that global perspective of how people everywhere else enjoy what we take for granted.
There you go. How much travel did you do with Frankie Frederick?
Not
Curious.
a lot. He had a series of schleppers, as what we would call them. They were known as the schlepperenses.
Okay, there you go.
So
This
I
is something
kinda-
that was in the contract.
I kind of rolled out with him at one point, and I was like, you know, this is a lot because it's work. Because you
Yeah.
got to get up before,
Mhm.
you know, you've got to make sure all the pieces are in place by the time he
yeah.
gets up,
Mm-hmm.
or everything's in place for the next stop. So I would say a year, and then right before he left us, I started going out on the road with him again. And every now and again, depending on where it was,
Sure.
he'd call and say, oh, you want to go? And I'd be like, oh, sure, especially if it's someplace that, you know, I could go for free.
Sure.
So not as much as others who were with him, but I think that global perspective made the outcome is what people appreciate and remember about him, about his home, because again, he considered, born in New York, he considered Chicago his home. And I was thinking about this recently, and I thought I just kind of roughly did some math. He spent 20 years of his life in Chicago.
Right.
10 years at each point. And I remember him saying in an interview once, sure, he's born and bred in New York, but he considered Chicago his home because that's where he grew up. That's where he honed his craft at. And so I think that impression and the love that he had for this city left an impression on people. And I think that's why we as Chicagoans appreciate and love him as much as we do.
Sure.
Is because he loved the city back.
He did. So true. Heather, you got a comment on sort of just the idea of like you as an artist looking at it, you know, possibly on the global side of it, because you traveled and you got
Yeah.
to around the country as well as overseas.
Yeah, I mean, I feel I'm always perpetually traveling, and to his point about considering Chicago your home, I'm a New York-born kid, but
Mhm.
I've been here since I was 7 years old. So forever I will probably be repping the city of Chicago because
Right.
it made me who I am, and I will always have my feet in this proverbial.
Did you ever have a conversation with Frankie about the civic piece of
No, we never had a discussion about being
Yeah.
New York-born or
Yeah.
feeling any sort of difference or anything like that. But I
Right.
mean, definitely Chicagoans will test your Chicago-ness.
Yeah,
For
exactly. Sure. No, you're
Every
right.
time it doesn't. So even when playing, case in point, playing overseas or having
Sure.
a chance to travel quite a bit, it
Mhm.
doesn't. Kids don't care if you just got back from Tokyo. There's
No.
4 people in the room.
Right.
You just better show and prove right now because they do not care.
That's exactly right. You know, we
Don't care.
we have a resident DJ at SmartBar right now that's going through that, and that's Maria Stamper, Black
Yeah.
Madonna. I mean, she's
Mhm.
going through the same thing where she's working a lot, but
Yeah,
it's
and-
like
and
you know,
props, but that's
she's playing
the thing.
Saturday night at SmartBar, and that's it. She's doing her Saturday night.
That's right. And it's like, because for everyone else, their world isn't changing. So you
Yeah.
have to be this constant
Yeah.
when you show up and play.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that standard is kind of something, a kind of a torch or flag that many Chicagoans who play music
Right.
or who are in film or any portion of the arts, there's this kind of common thread, which is this incredibly strong work ethos, and people respond to that
Yeah.
honesty as well.
Yeah.
So you meet a lot of Chicagoans or satellite Chicagoans wherever you are. By some way or reason, you find out you're from the same city. It's like, now I understand. You get that kind of camaraderie of like hard work.
Yeah, that ethos you talk about, I agree with you. And Frederick, Frankie did honor sort of a residency, here in Chicago for his whole life. I mean, no matter where he was, he would come back to Chicago, play either MLK Day or night before Thanksgiving or Valentine's Day. He'd always find those ways to continue his civic sort of flag, so to speak. Joel, I mean, you've traveled, you've been around. What's the global sense of what Frankie's work means, or how it incorporated into like what you were doing?
Well, I attribute house, period, to Frankie, period,
That's it.
across the line.
You're not going to get any disagreement up here.
In terms of a global, anything global, as I said, every city that I have played in outside of the United States have, my dancers would every night after the show find a house club. And to me, that is a pretty big thing, because no matter where you would go, there would be house music.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the thing that we were discussing earlier about, Chicagoans, I think there's this thing about Chicago underappreciating while they're here.
Mm-hmm.
The gifts and the talents and the diversity,
Mhm.
really, in terms of the representation of anything that we're doing.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to figure out.
It's really it's very difficult to figure out, and I've been doing it for 45 years.
Mm-hmm. So
I have a very strong appreciation for a global sense, and a sense of the world as being much bigger than Chicago. And I think that a lot of times, many people in Chicago get a certain perspective of who we are, and we are much bigger than we think we are, or that we are made to believe that we are. And it takes sometimes, like Josephine Baker had to leave.
Absolutely.
To go to Paris to
Mm-hmm.
find out who she was. You know what I'm saying? When she was here, nobody paid attention to her. And then all of a sudden she's in Paris and she's the diva. Well, the
Exactly.
same thing happened to my company in terms of leaving Chicago also.
Mm-hmm.
When you're here, it's like nobody pays attention. Your reviews are kind of like, maybe we'll review him this time, or maybe we won't review him this time, which is okay. You learn to live with that. But then you go to New York and bust it out,
Correct.
or you
Mhm.
go to London and bust it out, or you go to Belfast and bust it out, or you go to,
Right.
Amsterdam and bust it out, or Rotterdam, and people are like, where is this coming from?
Right.
It's from Chicago. Okay?
There you go. So true.
And I think that as I said, a lot of times, I'm not going to overtalk this, but
No, please do.
It's
good. It's really.
But I just want people to understand that we're so very gifted here in this city with so much talent that has not been noticed
Mm-hmm.
by the people that are here to notice it, and then we go someplace else to find out, to become validated. Or to find out what
Absolutely.
we are.
But isn't that sort of what Frankie went through as well?
Exactly.
Isn't that what we're talking about?
Like a metamorphosis, sort of.
Please, I didn't want to cut you off.
No,
Did you finish your thought?
Yeah,
Because
I
it was a
finished
beautiful
my
thought
thought.
about Chicago,
yeah,
underappreciated sometimes in our own town,
exactly. Yeah.
and then, come,
And then you find out, you grow to the point that you understand,
right,
that you can accept where Chicago is because it's here.
right,
That's the way it is.
right,
Then you realize that, okay, maybe people don't understand that, but I think that's kind of I don't want to say a political thing.
There's
Everything
that word
is
again.
politics.
well,
There's that word.
but
Everything is politics.
But it is a
You know,
support.
life is
It's a
politics.
support system, and it's
Yeah.
all, so you're talking about the press, you're talking about media, you're talking about radio, you're talking about television, all of it.
Right. And it can't all go in one direction.
Correct.
You know what I'm
Correct.
saying?
Right.
So I'm a proponent of let's spread it out.
I agree.
You know, let's look at all the talent that's around, and let's take that in and celebrate that.
Absolutely.
You know, and make
Yeah.
Chicago much more than we think it is.
Absolutely. Ralphie, I think that again, as an artist and someone who's traveled, extensively, continentally as well as internationally. I mean, again, we know that Chicago has its limitations, so to speak, at times. But how does that coming back and giving something bigger to the city affect someone like yourself?
I think that knowing or actually seeing Frankie's changes and what he went through and all the years that he went just trying different things and doing different venues and still coming in to play his residency when there's 5 people on the dance floor kind of thing. It keeps you in line, it keeps you humble, it keeps you moving. And it also helps you understand what the rest of us as artists are going through when we're doing our thing. And so just realizing that Frankie did what he did and the reasons why he did it was like basically is like what he said. It's like if you have a focus, he says that's what's going to keep you alive. That's what's going to keep you to survive.
Right. And would you say that, again, Frankie doing a lot of international travel and still coming back to Chicago. I mean, again, we're going to go to Dee in a second, but I think that all the DJs on this panel, I know as a promoter and as someone who's been doing business in the city for 35 years, that it's important that you don't lose sight of the fact that this is home, and that,
That's why I started to think about that. Not to interrupt you, I started to think
No,
about
please.
that, and that's why I started to say, you know what, it is my hometown.
Right.
I get discouraged because there's like 50 million parties every
Right.
weekend or every holiday thing, and it's just like I don't want to be tossed in the hat of many different types of things. I want it to be special,
Right.
So, I told myself, I think I need to start doing this residency thing again in Chicago.
Exactly.
Because this is where it is, and this is where I was made and where I grew up.
No, there's
Sure,
no
I can
question
go to
about it.
Europe and everything else, and it's
Right.
great, and it's awesome. They treat everybody like rock stars, and it's wonderful and everything. And you come back here, and nobody really cares.
Be-
My favorite was Berlin. When
Yeah.
I worked at Berlin, my friend Jim goes, somebody just called here asking about, well, I said, who's playing tonight? And they said, I told them, you were playing Ralphie Rosario, and they said, I thought he died.
Oh.
So
No
it's like,
way,
it's one of
baby.
those things, you know
No
what I'm
way,
saying? It's
baby.
just one of those things where you don't, once again, you could come back home, you can't get arrested. You go everywhere else, they're like, oh my God, here's some grapes.
Yeah.
Here's some water. Oh my God, are you thirsty?
What's interesting, and I'm going to turn this over to Dee in a second, is that we talked about Super Jane, and how this started on a Wednesday night in Smart Bar for a couple of dollars, and somehow that, I'm not going to use the word brand, I'm going to use the word entity. It is a great idea of women DJs in Chicago. It has lasted now how many years? When's the last part? Huh? 20th, right? And now we're doing this event in Smarco called Daphne, which is, again, directly related to that. I think you spun it, correct? Yeah. And my point is that I think that house music, and Frankie being the architect, again, this idea of the party or the event was very important. And I think that we've done that, clearly and demonstrated that by the artists that are on this panel. And so, Dee, what do you think about this sort of question is
Sure.
about the local and the global scope,
Well, I might have a different idea about it. I think he left a lasting impression on the city. I think the fact that sound systems changed because of Frankie was a big, big influence on the way that we heard house and received it. And I think about Shelter and Richard Long and the crossover, and frankly, being that being a direct result of Frankie's influence. And then I think about the street naming with Barack Obama. I don't think anybody else in the city could have had that done first. So it had to have been Frankie. Now there's a bunch of different ones, but Frankie had to have
More to
been the
come.
first for that, across city, everybody could say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I actually, because I work at Columbia now, I meet a lot of students who are young, and you wouldn't think they know who Frankie is, and they do, and they appreciate house music, and they appreciate vinyl, and they're 18 and 19, and so he still has quite an impression that he's leaving upon the youth. Even actually, one of my coworkers has the Reader article that they had on him, or the Sun Times,
Oh,
where
sure.
he was on the cover.
Right.
And she's an advertising person. She's in film and TV, and so I said, I walked in my first day. I was like, oh, she's got Frankie Knuckles on her, wall. I was like, that's so interesting to me. So I think we don't really see it all the time, especially if you're, thinking about, okay, how do I leave my own lasting impression on people?
Sure.
But I think we can all do what we do, with the exception of Ralphie, who was also doing what he did. But for us who came after Frankie,
Yeah.
we're all doing what we do because of him.
Right. Bravo. Thank you. That's beautiful. I just wanted to say that, for me as a fan, I remembered that he used to actually make cassette tapes. Does anyone remember this? And the idea was maybe at the end of the night he'd give you a cassette tape, or so it was like that was like sort of his calling card was like, did you get a mix? Did you get a mixtape? Or we used to record your mixes off the radio.
Actually, I got lucky enough when I was in New York to see him. He gave me a DAT, Frederick.
Oh,
A digital
very
tape, and it was
nice.
4 hours long.
We need to talk.
Oh,
no,
boy.
we don't.
There we go.
It's locked up. It's in a time capsule right now.
Very nice. I just want to make sure we're doing okay on time. Okay. So, real quickly, just the panel before we go to Q&A, and you might have some questions. Who has questions for us? Hands? Hands in the air? Anything? I see a few. Okay. One, D, I wanted to say one thing about Columbia. It's amazing because I went to school there, and I hear what you're saying about like that really great young group of people that are discovering vinyl for the first time. They're learning about house music. I remember clearly there's a label called DFA, which is a very kind of popular label, LCD sound system, and you all know about that. Well, Frankie did what they called a classic house mix for an artist by the name of Hercules in Love Affair. And if you remember this track, it was a renaissance moment for him as an artist. All of a sudden, it was like, oh, it's that piano. Oh, it's those pads. It's that beautiful, elegant, lush arrangement. And it was back in every club across the world.
Did you ever hear the story about that?
No, please tell me.
He said that he didn't want to do it.
He didn't
What?
want to do it.
He didn't want to do it.
Tell us.
Then he took ill
Yeah.
when they released it.
Right.
And so he was recuperating, and somehow somebody called him, or somehow he found out about it. And he's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? and they were like, oh, you haven't heard that, the record it was big or something, or had hit.
Really big. Oh, it was massive.
Yeah, he said he went to, in one of the interviews, he said he went to this club, I think he was playing in Greece or something.
Correct. Yeah.
And he was playing there, and then he played the song, and the whole room erupted, and he was like looking around going, what the?
That's right.
And somebody came up to him, he goes, oh my God, this song's so big, so big. And he's like, he had no idea.
So
and he
when
didn't want to do it.
when we meet James Murphy and Pat Mahoney from LCD Sound System, believe me, one of the reasons why they started working with us at Smart Bar and Metro was, because Frankie built that house in Smart Bar. And on that note, I wanted to, Jenny, do you want to see if some folks want to come up and give us a couple of questions? And you can ask questions to specific people or the panel. I think we've got another 15, 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, and we just want to have people come up here. This is being recorded, and so we want you to come up to ask your questions so we get it on tape. Who would like to go first?
Don't be shy.
Come
Don't
on
be
down.
shy. Come on down.
Come on down.
Dun,
Come
dun,
on
dun, dun.
And I'll just mention while people are coming down that this is being recorded by our partners with CAN TV, and we will post on social media once it is available to let you know when you can watch it or share with your friends who weren't able to be here.
This question's for the panel. My name is Chris Lara, DJ Pip Craze, I'm a big-time house head. I guess my question is, and I kind of agree with a lot of things that you guys were saying about how Chicago is not necessarily reflecting or paying homage to the DJs and producers of Chicago house music versus the world. I guess the question that I have for you guys is, what do you envision, or how do we move away from kind of degrading ourselves as a city and empowering ourselves more and promote ourselves more to become the mecca of house music, and kind of do as well like what some record labels done across the seas, like Defective Records. They have multiple events all over the place. They bring in DJs from Chicago and elsewhere, from the States over to Europe. How do we do that in Chicago?
Who wants to take this one? Anybody? I have an opinion, but Frederick, I see you took your glasses off, so. It's a big question. It's a really good question.
It is. I don't think there's an answer.
Yeah, a simple
or a
answer.
specific answer.
Right.
I think that entities that are doing things, I think that one way is that we continue to try to do what we do. Say, for instance, like Alan and the Chosen Few. You know what I mean? There's that one opportunity. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So if you bring in like Alison Limerick, well, why her? You know what I mean? I don't think there's a specific answer to that question. I can't give you one. Maybe my esteemed colleagues could, but I don't know how to answer that one.
Dee, do you have a question or an
I
idea?
think that collectively there's power in unifying, right? So
Correct.
I think that Chicago itself, so right now Frankie's gone, right? So we don't really have this figurehead, but Chicago itself has to become the figurehead. And so if we can elevate each other collectively, I think then we will all begin to have a louder voice. We will begin to have a seat at the table again. I like that you brought up Defected because as a model, they have taken a model that says, this is our house, right? And so really it's our house. And so they've kind of co-opted it and nobody has really said anything. So as a city, I think we have to be louder, we have to be more determined, and I think that we have to unite in a message. And we only have a few players out there now who are really doing it. I think Green Velvet and Derek, and those are the two that
Maria.
are kind of representing everybody from Chicago for Europe. I mean, people are going places and doing things, don't get me wrong, but it's just not as really, really big. And if you look at the list, the top people making all the money, all of those faces there really aren't a lot, and I don't even know if there are really any black and brown faces. And so we have to really think about how we put our energy out there and how we make people say, Chicago is still the Mecca. I know you said how we can become the Mecca again. Like, we are the Mecca. And so we really just need to own it.
I mean, I'm going to just jump in and say, beautiful. Remember, you know, with Chosen Few happening, still happening, terrific. D-Case is doing a big event at Millennium Park, great. I mean, that's the kind of support that we need to expect as citizens of the city of Chicago, number one. And then as fans, the quality should be there and should follow. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Okay, good, man. Thank you. So,
I mean, essentially, it is that unification, making sure that we as citizens show up, we support
absolutely.
one another. The quality is there and all
Right.
of that. I mean, this is exactly what I was
I think it's
expecting.
very important, especially with somebody as figure as myself or anyone here on this panel, is to be seen in any of these events and things that are going on. Supporting them from the ground up is very important. And I wish there was more. I wish we were doing a lot more in the summertime. I mean, Lollapalooza has all these crazy bands, and it's really crazy. All these people
but
fly in for this.
But with now is summertime, you have these annual smaller events that are catered
Yeah.
stages, case in point, West Fest, which is
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a great one.
I think it's awesome. I think it's
Yep.
awesome that this is happening.
and even
Yeah.
House of Soul and Pilsen.
Sure.
But that's part of the unification that we need to have in terms of North Side, South Side.
But it's up
You
to
know?
you.
And it's also about age too.
Absolutely.
And
right.
people feel that they're not included if a demographic is supposedly catered to from 45 and up or 35 and up. I think for me, House has always been inclusive in terms of the ages, in terms of the DJs that you hear play. And I think as an audience, we should also open up ourselves to hearing not just people that we love. Don't get me wrong. I'm always into discovery. That's just me as a
Sure.
music fan. So part of that support is sharing kids, music that they're doing or showing up and showing them love. It's those little things that really help give a sense of, inclusivity for the city.
Inclusive, exactly. Exactly. I see a Frankie Knuckles Foundation T-shirt here, so, come on up.
What I wanted to say is really, I think I have less of a question and more of I want to thank you guys for doing this, because I think one of the ways to speak to the question that preceded me is that there's an educational component that I think is important here. I developed a course that I teach at DePaul called The House Chicago Built, and it's about house music.
Terrific.
But what I'm often surprised by, particularly with students who, love EDM, and they come in like, oh, I took this course because, I love EDM, and they have like no clue about the history. So I think this educational component is important so that we don't go the way of jazz and blues and rock and roll. I know Martin Garrix and Carl Cox have this new movie that's streaming called What We Started, and I'm like, oh, what did you start?
Right.
So I think that's my main thing, and to ask maybe how can there be more educational events. I spoke at Black Portraitures at Harvard last weekend, and my presentation was on Robert Williams being a patriarch. Of
Was that you in front of the one that Robert posted?
Oh, I didn't.
Wonderful.
Okay, I was too busy taking it in, but I did run into Eric Williams from the Silver Room there. But I think, again, people were tweeting, oh, I didn't know black gay men started this. And so I think education is important, and I wanted to know if you guys have plans to kind of spread this out and kind of keep building the educational component so that people know more about the music, and maybe they'll understand the inclusive beginning and get back to that. So, any plans?
Well, Dee, you're an educator.
Well, I do work with a foundation called Girls Rock Chicago.
Correct, yeah.
So I've been teaching a curriculum that I developed for young girls to learn how to DJ, but it's really more about self-confidence and self-esteem and building those skills through musicality, right? So
What's the average age?
the ages are from 6 to 16.
Oh, it's great.
So, and it's, I start them with the fundamentals, right? So there's just boxes in a room. They've got speakers and turntables and needles, and And I say, okay, let's put it together. So we start with them learning just the technical aspect, how to connect, what the connections are, what they mean, what things do, and before they can even play. And then I bring out my house records, and
There you
and
go.
they're like, "What is this? This is not, Miley Cyrus, whatever." So, but they get acquainted with some Frankie Knuckles remix of Michael Jackson or something,
There you go.
So we just start there, and I start them with doubles because how do you learn how to match a blend, right? So I think I do what I can on that level. That's where I'm at. I hope that in the future at Columbia I'm able to do more of that, but I think the education piece is crucial.
Yeah.
Crucial. And thank
And-
you for doing what you do.
Thank you for doing what you do.
And
Absolutely.
To add to that, that's one of FKF's initiatives is the educational component. The problem, or I shouldn't say the problem, finding the right fit with the right partner to present that sort of platform. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a very interesting.
We
How
took
many
it back.
people in here have a record player or a turntable at home? I'm curious. His hands. Look at
Oh,
this.
look at that.
Oh my God.
It's fantastic.
All right, okay, we're quick. What about a show of 45s? Look at this.
7-inch records?
That's crazy. Look at that.
Yeah. I love that.
The other question I wanted to ask was to you, how was Frankie's relationship, Mr. Dunstan? How was Frankie's relationship with Ron Hardy? He left to go overseas. Now Ron Hardy is the face then, and how did he accept that?
How did Ron accept that? Oh, there is this long funneled rumor that they did not get along. I'm suspect of where it came from, but they were friends.
Good.
Frankie had his style, Ron had his style.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's all I could say about that. They were friends. I don't think there was any competition between them. I think Frankie had an opportunity to do some things, and Ron, for whatever reason, stayed at home locally. Remember, Ron came back to Chicago after living and playing in L.A. So it wasn't that he didn't have a reputation and exposure. I don't know. But all I can say is that they treated each other as brothers.
They never spend together.
No. Now, you mean
I'm
why
asking
they
you,
didn't?
yeah.
I don't know.
That's okay. I mean,
Yeah, I
but
don't-
both
I
of them
don't
was
know.
great DJs. You know
Absolutely.
What I'm saying? But we
No,
already
for
know
sure.
Frankie is the Godfather.
For sure.
He brought the sound to Chicago. It was the sound. He brought the turntable speaker. He had the combination that made us want to adapt to his music because he knew how to manipulate that sound system. And that sound system is what bring everybody together.
Sure, but Ron did the same thing. There are certain records when I hear them, I immediately think of Ron Hardy because Ron was the person who made me love that record. I'll give you an example, Sweet Lucy. Nobody played Sweet Lucy like Ron Hardy could play Sweet Lucy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
so
got
they both had their own niche.
Right. But my main question was, she answered it with the other young lady about how we're going to keep the sound going with the digital world coming into play. But you got people out there training, and I follow the DJ Alicia. You know, I follow the battles from Chicago to New York to Detroit now, and they all spinning vinyl. They're not doing the computer thing. You know what I'm saying? So it's good to see that it's still going on. You know, they started this in what, 79, when they tried to kill disco.
Yeah. Disco Demolition.
I appreciate all of y'all.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you.
How you doing?
Good evening. First, I'd like to say how much we appreciate you guys with the platform. Two-part question. One, do you think that a place like the Warehouse could exist in this day and time? knowing that somehow or another, I think house heads, we're not cheap. We'll spend money. Like when we partied at the warehouse, you paid to get in, but then there was a juice bar and it was just a good time. Whereas when you go to a house club now, we go in to dance, but they want you to buy the libations and things of that nature, which really house music for some of us at the warehouse was like going to church and getting our good time on. Then we look at when celebs like Frankie and yourselves go overseas. I was fortunate enough to catch Frankie Knuckles in South Africa. And they utilized an old train station, and Frankie was maybe 40 feet in the air as a guard, but you had more than 16,000 people there that spent about $100 each to get in, and that was only in Johannesburg.
So it's like a festival?
And they had more than 15,000 people there. But when we come home to the House of Blues, do we not show up because the sponsorship monies are not there to put in to really do the advertisement like it's been done overseas? Because we here too love Frankie. We do show up, but with house heads, it's like charging us to get into church, I kind of think.
Well,
No, well,
Frederick, let me take this one real quick. Let me just say, there are many factors that go into that. You know, I can see our colleague Alan King sitting in the audience here from Chosen Few. There are many things that go into this, and it is a lot about marketing. There is sponsorship involved, etc. It's how many dates an artist plays in a certain market. I don't want to be too data-driven as far as a promoter, but I understand what you're saying. To answer your first question, and that is, would the warehouse be able to exist today? No, I don't think so. I think that there's too many legal and political things that would be involved to do a free space like that. You know, again, underground parties do exist here in this town. Some of them are safe, some of them are not safe. I'm not going on into that conversation right now. But I think it would be hard because of the fact that there are the law of after hours clubs has changed so dramatically from the 70s through the 80s into the 90s that it's either a legal space or not a legal space. So that answers that for you. Frederick, did you have something else that you wanted to add?
Okay. People here in Chicago, there's that group of people who will feel entitled that they should get something for free. Okay? I see a number of you nodding your head saying yes, because that's the reality of it. I do an event for Frankie with Joe for Frankie's birthday every January. We've done it for the this was our fourth year? Fourth year. And the number of people, and it's a fundraiser. The number of people who call, can I get on a guest list? You know, people expect something for nothing all the time. So those people who spend. Those people who don't are usually the ones who are the biggest critics of what you're trying to do. I always divert my attention to the people. There's a saying that I have. The people who paid are the VIPs, not the people who are on the guest list.
I agree.
So hopefully that gives you an answer to what I'm trying to say.
And that is support. You want to support.
There are people who want what they want. That's just human nature. And they want it for free, unfortunately.
I do understand, and I appreciate that, and I know that the talent has to be paid and the overhead. Just like you brought up the Chosen Few. For a long time, I loved the Chosen Few picnic, but today it's not what it was. And that's not taking anything away from it.
Well, just say it's not
evolved.
for you anymore.
It's evolved.
It's evolved, and it had to evolve. You have to understand the business side of what, here again, it goes back to that question. People want what they want. You want the emotional part of it, but you have to realize there's a practical side to it. That the city's not calling and says, hey, we're giving you the park. Come on over.
The cleanup and
It's got to be
Oh,
paid
no.
for.
They don't
gotta
give
pay-
you the part.
So it had to evolve in that so they can get their hands around it and better manage it as an event. Otherwise, it was going to be crazy. So you have to respect that part of it.
I do respect
And
it.
as I tell people, either go or don't.
Well, I do respect it, and yes, that is an option. It really is.
Well, there's always an option. But the other part of it is bills have got to get paid at the end of the day.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. Jenny, is there anyone else there for?
For just two more questions quickly, so this young lady's.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to Chicago Public Library and One Book Chicago for doing this. I'm here in two ways. One is a Frankie total stan. I have loved him since since 1985, 86, where I discovered him on my Sony cassette radio with the headphones. I was flipping radio stations. I'm from Champaign, Illinois, so I was in Chicago visiting friends, flipping. I heard BMX. I'm like, what is this music? so it was great. And then Frankie came on, so it was great. Like I said, I have loved him for these many years. When my friend told me that he had passed, I was on a CTA bus, and she said, did you hear the news? I'm like, what? Frankie died. And I was like, Frankie who? And then there was a moment. And all I could do to keep it together while I was on the bus till I got home. 3 days straight, I cried like I knew him. I shook his hand once, and it made my life. And I thought, I want to get in that DJ booth. Didn't happen, but I shook his hand. So thanks for keeping him alive. Thanks for all that you're doing. And I want to mention that his vinyl collection is at the Stony Island Art Bank. I'm so glad it's here. This is the librarian part. I'm so glad it stayed in Chicago. I'm so glad it's here. I saw a picture of it. I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but I saw a picture and literally I teared up because he touched all those records. And so thank you. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think that we end on that note because it was so beautiful. It's so moving. Do we have one more question? Oh, okay. Oh, well.
Please be as beautiful.
Hello there, Johnny. How are you, brother?
Hey, thanks for the encouragement. I appreciate that.
You're welcome, sir.
If I wasn't so
It better be a good question.
Yeah, it better be a good question.
Ladies and gentlemen, Johnny Oppenheimer.
Actually, it is a good question, I think. So, thanks for being here. Thanks for doing everything that you did to get here. As a lifelong Chicagoan, I've been here for a lot of great times and bad times. When somebody wins a championship, instantly everybody knows that they won. It's all over the world. Everyone's excited. With house music, it was like that somehow. I don't understand what it was. Maybe you can let me in on it or something. But I remember hearing it for the first time when I was a little kid. Probably about 81 or something. And then it seemed like the next day I was on my school bus listening to it in stereo. And that's not because I had a radio, it was because the cars on either side of the school bus were playing the same station at the same time. And then overnight imports were coming in and people were gramophone left and right. And this is pre-internet, so I'm not sure if it's something that's replicable or what the tipping point was, but I was wondering if y'all had an impression of what that was, whether it was from a Chicago perspective or New York or wherever you were at the time, just because it just happened and I didn't know how it happened. Glad it did.
Ralphie, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, take that one, Ralphie.
Mm-hmm. Test. I think what it was, especially being 14 and a half years old when I started playing records, it was because there was just such a love, even through the days of disco, and then disco technically dying, which is such a lie. it just went underground and it became even better, became
Even
bigger.
better. Mhm.
And then you've got people in Chicago like Frankie and Ron Hardy and all the rest of those guys putting a light on the next thing, the metamorphosis of what disco and how it expanded into this house and dance or whatever. And I think it was because every DJ in Chicago, everybody who was playing these clubs or after hours or whatever, they had such a huge love for what it was. And when it finally, that love got on the airwaves, it went crazy. It went crazy. And then it graduated from the airwaves, it graduated all the way around the world. And then London took it over and packaged it. And then where else can you go? Anywhere around the world where Jack Your Body was #1 on their national chart. It was scary.
Promised Land.
Yeah, it was very, very scary. It was all of a sudden there was a new thing that happened. It was the sound of Chicago, you know, and it was because of the love that we have. And it was just an undying thing. I don't care how tired we are. I don't care the late nights or whatever. It's just the thing of making all those people come together in that room until 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. You've done your job. And that love grew so large that it spread all over the place for this stuff. And Frankie was one of the guys carrying that torch. So,
Absolutely.
you know, and it's a legacy. He's a legend, and I will hold that to the highest respect.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists for taking their time to be here with us. I just want to let you know, if you're into vinyl, there's a collection of vinyl you can check out here from your Chicago Public Library on the 8th floor. And make sure you go get your library card up on the ground floor. Thanks.